Hello everyone, this is John's never-ending list of random things to do, back here with some more Celica Supra content. For this video, I'll be showing you how to replace the front shocks. Look how bouncy my front end is. And I'll go ahead and show you how to replace the rear one as well. Let's go ahead and get started with the front shocks. If you look right under this dust boot, you'll find a nut. You'll want to hit it with some penetrating fluid. And while it's doing its work, go ahead and chalk off the back wheels. Pop open the hood and start busting these nuts loose. Next, go ahead and jack up the car. Then place some jack stands. Since this isn't the strongest point, I went on ahead and left the jack in place. Now these 4 nuts and the wheel can be completely removed. I used a channel lock to grip the nut like so and loosened it. You'll want to get it loose enough so you can move it freely like so. Next, you'll want to remove these two 17mm bolts. They are accessible from the bottom. Use a breaker bar to break them loose and then completely remove them. While removing the bolt on the back side, you'll notice the steering will keep moving. Go ahead and fit your socket in firmly, then give it a good yank. Make sure you don't strip the head of the bolt. Once you get it loose, remove it completely. Next, you'll want to remove the brake line here, using a 10mm flare nut wrench. Break loose this nut here, then remove it completely. Since we're introducing air to the system here, we'll have to bleed the brakes later. Using a flathead or any prying device that you prefer, remove this retainer. Once the retainer is removed, the brake line will just fall through, and we'll cover it with a piece of cloth so it doesn't get all over the place. Also, have an oil pan ready for drips from this location. Next, you'll want to remove your end links completely. Now these are the last 3 pieces holding the shock tower up. You'll want to completely remove 2 of these nuts and loosen one enough so you can spin it by hand. This is just to make sure the entire shock tower doesn't accidentally fall. The strut tower sits on top of 2 dowels. If you kick the lower control arm down just a bit, it'll pop out. Now with everything loose, hold the strut tower firmly using one hand and the other to remove the last nut. Now everything falls out like so. Next, you'll want to use a pair of spring compressors to compress your spring. You can borrow these at your local auto store. I'll also leave a link in the video description below. For this process, you'll want to try to evenly compress the spring. Alternate between the 2 sides. Eventually, the springs will stop compressing. At this point, use an impact to remove this 19mm nut. Next, remove the hat. And if your upper perch isn't easily removable by hand, go ahead and give it a few love taps. Next, remove the spring, followed by the old dust boot. Then remove this nut completely. If you did not loosen this nut while the strut tower was still on the car, I'll show you another method. Finally, we can remove the shock. So if you made it this far and you forgot to loosen this nut, you'll want to find a plumber's wrench, place it on the nut like so, then using a hammer, give it a good smack. From here we can go back to using the channel locks to grip the nut firmly and spinning it loose. Now remove the nut completely and remove the shock. Alright, it is finally time to put this thing back together. First, we're going to fill it up with some oil. Any oil that you have laying around. This will help the shock to stay cool inside. Now time to insert the shock, and you'll know you put too much oil. Just watch what happens here. You'll see me continuously press the shock in. The best solution is probably to just dump out some oil. If you purchased new shocks, it should have came with a new nut. Go ahead and tighten it by hand first, then snug it down using your channel lock. If your dust boot was old and beat up, hopefully you bought a new one. Press it in here like so, and it should stop right about here. Next up is the spring. This part should meet with the lower perch right here. And this upper portion of the spring should meet this part right here. If you look at the upper portion of the shaft, there's a flat end right here, and right on the other side is another flat end. It should fit right in here. Mine looks a little damaged, but these two sides should be straight. With all of that in mind, align the two and place it in. Next, place the hat like so. Then thread in the new nut that came with your shock. I went ahead and tightened it as far as possible with my fingers. I'll torque it down to spec later on. Next, the spring compressor can be loosened. You want to make sure the spring stays within the perch. Then continue to loosen the spring compressors. You'll see that the spring will continuously be misaligned, so you'll want to keep an eye on it. Now just gradually loosen the spring compressors. Remember to alternate between the two sides. Okay, and this thing is ready to be installed. From here you want to push the shock tower up. You want to try your best to put a nut on one of these studs. So here I go, pushing it up into the hole and letting it rest on my leg. Now using my free hand to thread in one nut. Next you want to push down the lower control arm and let it rest on here like so. Now the other nuts can be threaded in. And with these three holding the shock tower up, you no longer have to worry about it falling. On the lower control arm, there are two dowels, one here and one somewhere over here. Just move the shock tower back and forth and it should fall back into place. There it goes. Next, reinstall the brake line. Place it through here like so. Then insert its retainer and tap it back into place. Next, you want to tighten this by hand, then snug it down. Just double checking to make sure I tighten this nut. And it looks good. Now this 17mm bolt can be reinstalled. And don't forget the other side as well. Then torque them down to 72 foot-pound. Don't forget to reinstall the sway bar end links. And we are almost done. Torque this nut down to 34 foot-pound. And these nut to 27 foot-pound. If you still have your old dust cap, place it like so. Finally, the front wheel can go back on, followed by the nuts. And then torquing them down to 80 foot-pounds. Alright, now that the front are done, let's go ahead and tackle the back. Start by releasing the hatch. In the back here, you'll want to remove this cap. And don't forget to chalk off the front wheels. Now using an impact, you'll want to completely remove these two nuts. Followed by this washer and this bushing. Now you'll want to jack up the car. Next, remove this 14mm bolt here. And just wiggle the shock out. Here we have the new shock. It comes with new washers and bushings. Start by placing a washer here, followed by a bushing, and then followed by another washer. Make sure this one is the second washer. Place it on here like so. Now shove it back through this hole here. And slide the bottom portion back into here. Get this bolt started by hand. Then torque it down to 27 foot-pounds. Up here you want to insert a bushing, followed by the washer, and then 2 nuts. The big one goes first. Thread it in by hand first, then use the impact to send it. Follow that up with the thinner nut, then use the impact to send it. Now to cap this off, lower the car, and we're finally done. Before driving off, don't forget to bleed the brakes. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys for the next random project.